5 years old, my aunt told me not to touch the hot iron. She was very clear about it, very direct. Then she made the mistake of leaving the room, and I put my entire hand on it. Now, I'd like to say I've gotten smarter since then, and the essay I'm about to read you suggests the jury is still out, not just on me, but on all of us. It's called The Heat Travels Slowly, and it's about why the lessons that once kept us from doing stupid things don't work the same way anymore. The feedback loops that shaped human behavior for most of history have been stretched so far by modern systems that by the time you feel the burn, you've already forgotten you reached out. The heat travels slowly. Why modern consequences don't teach the lessons they used to. I still remember the iron. I was about 5 years old. My aunt was ironing clothes, the kind of slow, rhythmic work that fills a quiet house with heat and the smell of cotton. I watched, transfixed, and a moment into it, she looked at me before she stepped away and said very clearly, "Don't touch the iron. It's hot." She was not vague, nor was she abstract. She was very direct. She even wagged a finger at me, as I recall. She left the room, and of course, I put my entire hand on the iron. Now, I don't remember hesitation or curiosity dressed up as caution. I remember contact and instant blinding pain. I remember the shock of it, how fast it went from nothing to something I couldn't ignore. And I remember the aftermath well enough that, well, decades later, I can still feel it if I think about it too long. And it wasn't because I didn't understand the words either. It was because I didn't believe them, or maybe more accurately, I didn't believe them enough to let them override whatever impulse told me to find out for myself. Well, that's obviously a hard lesson when you're 5, and it's a dangerous one when you're an adult. Children learn with immediate feedback. You touch something hot, you get burned. You scrape your knee, you bleed. The cause and the effect sit right next to each other, close enough that even a stubborn kid can connect the dots. Pain becomes instruction, memory aids in prevention. You don't need a study, a debate, or a panel discussion about whether irons are, in fact, when they're plugged in use, hot. You just don't touch it again. At least not that way. The strange thing about modern life is that we outgrow that kind of feedback. Not because we get smarter, but because the systems we live inside of get larger, more complex, and more forgiving in the short term. The distance between action and consequence stretches out. Sometimes it disappears entirely, or it seems to. You can make a bad decision and support a bad idea, ignore a warning, and wake up the next day with no evidence you were wrong. And for a while, that works. And when it works, it teaches the wrong lesson. Now, I've written previously about what happens when a society becomes prosperous and stable enough to forget the dangers that made those conditions necessary. Measles becomes basically chickenpox. Polio and iron lungs become a chapter in a dusty old history book. The system that prevented those outcomes start to feel excessive, even intrusive. The absence of pain is mistaken for the absence of risk. And once that happens, warnings start to sound like overreactions, or to some, like an attempt to control. And lately, I've seen people use the phrase stove touching to describe this moment. The idea is blunt. Some people only learn when consequences become personal, when the abstract becomes immediate, when the warning turns into something you can't wave away because it's happening to you or to someone you care about. Now, if you don't believe the iron is hot, eventually you're going to put your hand on it. But here's the part people miss when they use that phrase a little too casually. When a child touches a hot stove or an iron, the lesson is contained. When a society does it, almost nothing is. The burn doesn't show up as a single moment. It spreads through systems people don't think about until those systems stop working the way they expect. It starts in places that feel distant. A shipping lane halfway around the world becomes unstable. Insurance rates for cargo quietly spike. Tankers reroute or stop moving altogether. And none of that feels like your problem. Then fuel prices move. Not dramatically at first, just enough to notice. The fuel isn't only something you pump into your car. It's embedded in everything that gets to you. Trucking costs rise, shipping costs rise, and airlines adjust routes and fares. Then it shows up where people actually live. Your grocery bill gets strange. Not just eggs, but bread, meat, and produce, all inching upward in ways that don't quite line up with what you told the economy is doing. Months later, fertilizer costs hit farmers. Yields change, supply tightens, and prices move again. It doesn't feel like one event. It feels like a series of expensive annoyances. And then the second order effects arrive. Generic medications, the kind people take every day without thinking about it, depend on global supply chains that require stability. Here's a quote from Dr. William Feldman, Associate Professor of Medicine in the Division of Pulmonary Critical Care, Sleep Medicine, Clinical Immunology and Allergy at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. He says, I worry about generic drugs in particular, which represent 90% of prescriptions filled in the US and deliver thin profit margins for manufacturers. India and China are the biggest suppliers of generic drugs to the US, and prolonged or widening conflict could raise costs for generic firms, leading to higher prices and or shortages for patients, he said. So, disrupt shipping, raise input costs, tighten production, and suddenly the issue isn't just price, it's availability. Prescriptions get harder to fill, refills take longer, and pharmacies shrug without explanation. No headline announces it, it just accumulates. Insurance adjusts next, quietly. Risk models change, premiums creep, coverage narrows, and you don't connect it to anything specific. Just a growing sense that everything costs more and delivers less. Meanwhile, the cost of making ordinary things rises. Plastics, packaging, chemicals, all tied to energy inputs. The cheap, forgettable items people assume will always stay cheap start inching up as well. Laundry detergent, toothpaste, school supplies. The background noise of daily life gets louder. Cities feel it too, as fuel and materials and services all cost more. Budgets tighten, and something gets cut or deferred or quietly passed on in fees. It becomes local, whether you were paying attention or not. And through all of this, the most important thing is what doesn't happen. There is no single moment where someone says, this is the result of that decision. There is no clean line between cause and effect, just a slow accumulation of friction. And even then, the lesson doesn't always take. More's the pity. People don't reliably update their beliefs when things go wrong. They reinterpret, redirect blame, and find a story that lets them keep the decision, which means the idea that people need to touch the hot stove contains a dangerous assumption that pain produces clarity. It sometimes does, sure, but more often, it doesn't. I still remember that iron because the lesson stuck. The pain was immediate, undeniable, and directly tied to what I did. I didn't need anyone to explain it to me afterward. But that's the kind of lesson you only get when the system is small enough to hold it. We don't live in small systems anymore. We live in ones where the stove is so far away, the heat travels so slowly, and by the time you feel it, it's already touched a lot more than your hand. And we still like to believe we'd recognize it before we reached out. I did too. That was the heat travels slowly from my Substack newsletter, All the Fits This News. You might be watching this video right here on All the Fits This News, or you might be listening to it on a podcast that I have piped it into. Either way, if something in here stuck with you, and if you want to argue with me about it, the best place to do that is on Substack, where I publish new essays regularly on this kind of thing: systems, consequences, the gap between what we're told and what we eventually figure out the hard way. And the link to subscribe is in the show notes, along with anything else I mentioned today. And again, it's free to subscribe. And if you're already a subscriber, you have my genuine appreciation and mild suspicion that you have excellent taste. I would also like to add, though, that if you'd like to become a paid subscriber, you can get in early on a lot of this stuff, some goodies that the freebies don't get, and a lot more. So I hope you'll check that out. Just go to the link in the show notes and you'll find out a lot more about all the Fits This News. You also can find links to where you can buy my mystery novels and find some of my other work, etc. Anyway, thanks so much for joining me, and keep your hands away from that hot stove if you can.